Good morning. Today is Wednesday, January 17th, 2024. It's 9 a.m. and this is a meeting in Senate Natural Resource Energy. We are returning our work today to S213, an act relating to the regulation of wetlands, river corridor development and safety. And we have the Agency of Natural Resources in with us this morning. Good morning, Commissioner Batchel.
Thanks so much, Chair Bray. Morning, committee members. My name is Jason Batfelder. I'm the newest commissioner for the DEC. When I was last here, you had invited us in for a high-level look at some of what to expect to collaborate on during the session, and I failed to identify some of the priorities that I saw as important to me and to the department as I set out, but I'll take just a second to state them now as they unfolded, and I get a broader understanding every day of what our challenges are and what is expected of us as a conservation agency and department. And certainly the first two that come to mind are PFAS and PCB remediation and the understanding of what we're up against with regards to the damages that have been done to the resource over the last 70+ years. And equally as important are our floodplain corridors, our aging infrastructure and dams, and our wetlands challenges because of the rainfall we're facing and the ups and downs we see starting in July of last year and continuing until last week, essentially, maybe even further. But I apologize for not establishing those early on. I think they're probably going to evolve. I'm sure they'll evolve as I get my feet under me here. But I wanted to see those in front of you, my second time being here. So thanks for hearing that. I'm going to read my testimony here, and I think you'll find a common theme with the secretaries in line as a conservation agency. Mine is going to rely on a lot of work that we have done that I'm learning about every day and frankly astounded by, and then the secretary is going to lean in on some of the challenges that the bill presents to us. But thank you first for hearing this testimony from my staff last week and the weeks prior, and now for this opportunity for Secretary Moore and me to discuss this bill with you.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing your staff last week. We had a great tutorial all week long and learned a lot. So
I listened to every word and then again at 1.5 speed, and so I'm certain that you got a lot more out of it than I did, being as new as I am, but I'm previously surrounded by badges and guns, now surrounded by scientists. It is extraordinary for me, and I'm just humbled that the understanding of what they do every day and the fluency with which they can relay it to you all. I'm playing catch up every minute of every day, but it's extraordinary. So thank you. I would love a quiz, and I'll fail it and I'll study it. But no, I would love a quiz. It'd be great. So I'd like to begin by pointing out some of the highlights from the wetlands program. You heard from Laura Lafayette last week, and from Will Duane also. And as Laura and Will pointed out, conservation is core to our agency mission. And all three departments work together to make sure we are taking advantage of our partnerships and opportunities around conservation. As Laura and Will both noted, wetlands mapping is crucial to wetlands restoration and protection, and DEC has long recognized these benefits. We have been actively mapping wetlands for the National Wetlands Inventory since 2019. There's a bullet here that I'll point out. DEC appreciates the $250,000 allocation of one-time general funds in fiscal year 23 to complete the comprehensive update of statewide Vermont significant wetlands inventory maps, coupled with an ongoing base appropriation to keep maps current You may recall a slide that we showed last week that showed our timeline. Starting in 2019 and I believe culminating in 2026, where we plan to have all these mapped and then turn over to public comment. But it's a timeline that I believe accelerates 4 years or it stages to be completed 4 years sooner than your proposed timeline. I know the secretary will bring that up. Next, while the Vermont wetland rules currently require no net loss, data from the past 5 years show that the permit projects, excuse me, are actually resulting in a net gain, which I'd like to point out, I think is extraordinary for the amount of, essentially holes being dug in the earth for houses and projects that we stand to gain wetlands, even those, even though in those challenges is something that I'm rapidly growing in appreciation for. This is not reflected evenly across all counties and locations, but it is still significant. And we also have a slide that was shown to you last week that shows this net gain over time. Some counties are better than others, but some counties are bearing this wetlands gain, and it's wonderful for them. The agency has been protecting and restoring wetlands in Vermont for decades, and as you have heard, Fish and Wildlife is the largest land owner of wetlands in the state. Some specific recent stats in particular are worth mentioning from Fish and Wildlife alone. Using the EPA Lake Champlain Basin Program grant funds, $2.75 million have been spent since 2020 on acquisitions and wetlands restoration. That translates to over 1,500 acres acquired in the Lake Champlain Basin. 1,235 of those acres are wetlands and are being restored to wetlands. Other Fish and Wildlife acquisitions since 2011 include 2,500 acres of wetlands and over $2 million spent. So these efforts are ongoing. As you met, Will Duane, dedicated individual. This is all he does. ANR's coordinated wetland conservation and restoration initiatives is marrying multitudes of water quality and flood resilience benefits with benefits to fish, wildlife, and their habitats, to say nothing of the public benefits for wildlife-based activities like bird watching, photography, paddling, fishing, hunting, and more. I'm going to move on to, so that's wetlands. I'm going to move on to flood hazard and river corridor management. Rebecca Piper and Rob Evans, who you met, are the state's floodplain manager and rivers program manager, respectively. And they spoke to you Thursday about their programs and the significant work that they do, and how the understanding of floodplains and river corridors has changed significantly since the 1960s. Understanding that time span, undoubtedly some of you are thinking, and I am, that in 60 to 70 years, our understanding will probably have evolved again. And I know every facet of society thinks about that now, right? We didn't used to think about things like that. But now if we look ahead many, many years and wondering what are we currently doing wrong, PFAS 7 years ago, no now, in 7 years, what will we understand? Just a thought. The language specific to inundation flood hazards in S213 right now, well-intended but unmanageable as written, as I think Rob Evans pointed out. The expansion of the FARC rule would result in the state taking on the regulation of all land uses in the FEMA flood hazard area. In the 274 communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, of which I believe Rebecca is the Vermont president, chair president. She runs it anyway. Currently, these 274 communities regulate land uses in FEMA mapped flood hazard areas as part of their obligations as participants in the NFIP. S213 proposes to flip this work to ANR to administer under the flood hazard area and river corridor rule. Early estimates are that this shift is in responsibility would likely take somewhere around 15 to 20 new staff just in Rebecca's shop to administer this mandate. SB 13 also proposes that ANR regulate map river corridors about 5,600 miles of the larger rivers and streams around the state. And those 5,600 miles of river and stream occupy 209,000 acres of river bottom land, which is staggering. This is 5 times the land mass as the Lake Shoreline Encroachment Program, which is only 42,000. Given the scale of area contemplated for river corridor regulation, we think there are important steps that should be taken before rural jurisdiction is extended. And I believe the secretary will be able to get into what we're alluding to here. On to dam safety. Dam safety was in the front of everyone's mind this past summer, and rightfully so, with our high inventory, aging infrastructure, and the water that was held back by the 3 dams that we rely on here locally. I've spent a few days in the field since I arrived at DEC, and undoubtedly, one of the most impactful was the day I spent with Ben Green, who's the dam safety section chief. Met him a couple times now. I visited the 3 Washington County dams that he described in detail for you, and I was able to see firsthand how they were applied during the July floods. I hope you all get a chance to take field trips sometime with that. He's a great guy, and he's are you? Oh, yeah. I don't know. I can't speak for him whether or not he'd love to take you, but he was willing to take me. Nothing against you, for he's the busiest guy in show business.
He's highly recommended.
He's highly recommended, yes, he's a wonderful presenter and does a great job. I dare say he thrives out there standing on those dams talking about it. We appreciate the attention on the dam safety program, as we have many important improvements underway, including progress with the Army Corps of Engineers on our flood control dams on the Winooski, our second phase of our dam safety program rulemaking process, and completing our state-owned dam safety assessment. The dam safety program is undergoing a rulemaking process that is significant and that will make mandatory A, what is currently voluntary, and B, dam ownership requirements. As this bill gets in front of that process. That's the end of my written testimony. I'm happy to attempt to answer questions.
You're waiting.
Thank you, Chair Bray.
Good morning.
I'm so happy to be back. Yeah. They don't have snowplows in Nashville, so that's why I'm delayed. Okay, so I have a bunch of questions, but it sounds like maybe this is like the teaser before the answers. Perhaps you will defer, but I'm just wondering how you expect municipalities to maintain the burden of responsibility on this when you're saying that it would take 15 to 20 staff members to accomplish it by the state. So it's just I'm confused because we now have our towns who are the least funded, lowest staffed, least expert in this with doing it. So it's not getting done.
Mhm.
So Vermonters are at risk. So I'm just kind of wondering, is there work that you're contemplating, or you're just accepting that this isn't gonna get done?
If I could, Jason,
Please.
for the record, Julie Moray and our secretary, it is getting done. If it isn't getting done, towns are out of compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program, and no one in those communities would be able to purchase flood insurance. So I think we need to be clear. The work is currently being done. We acknowledge the burden to communities, and in my testimony, I'll make some recommendations about how we feel, what steps we feel could be taken in order to allow the agency to better support municipalities. But ultimately, there is real value to be gained in having this implemented at a local level. And I can explain more as to why.
So how did you come up with the 15 to 20 number then, if it's being done?
Because there's 274 communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Some of them are village centers versus towns, but we have 274 out of, I think, 295 eligible municipal entities within the state. And made some assumptions based on if we were to take over responsibility for all 274 that currently participate.
So how many staff members are currently doing it by municipalities?
It is a role and responsibility that rests with somebody within the community. And I don't want to say in no locations. My understanding is there are no communities where it is currently a full-time role. In some places it sits with the zoning administrator, in some places it sits with the town manager, in some places it sits with a volunteer emergency coordinator. There are different ways that communities are meeting this obligation.
Okay, so yeah, I think that's where like my confusion is, because it seems like if it's happening on a volunteer level, unpaid staff position. Where's the number of, then you'd need 15 to 20 full-time people coming from, because if, do you get what I'm saying, like it just. So it's not a 40-hour-a-week job for anyone in each of these municipalities. Why would it then become? Yeah, I guess I'm just confused by
Because
that.
by our math, 274 part-time people probably equates out to about 15 full-time employees, along with the management needed to support that implementation.
So we have 271 current volunteers or part-time people doing it?
274 communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and there is somebody in each one of those communities responsible for ensuring its implementation.
Okay. Do we have to keep like a list of those people?
I don't know, we could follow up with Rebecca and ask.
Thank you.
Jim Watson?
Oh, good morning, sorry I was late. Thinking about the dam safety issues, so are you feeling like the current rulemaking process is setting us on a sufficient trajectory, or how do you feel about the suggestions in 213 around the dam issues? I think I might have just missed it, but just want to make sure I'm clear.
I will attempt to. Should I pass? I will pass.
What was the question?
Do you feel like the trajectory that you're on with the current rulemaking path is sufficient? / how do you feel about the suggestions around dam safety that are in 213?
Sure, I mean, I think, so my name is Maggie Jenner, I'm Deputy Secretary for the Agency of Natural Resources. I would argue that the dam safety program's biggest priority is maintaining the staff that they currently have, which is they have limited service positions that they'd like to see as classified positions, but also they are moving in the right direction for the rulemaking to be completed. And I think their biggest concern with 213 is that they feel like the dam safety provisions are getting ahead of the rulemaking process. And they hope to move what is now a voluntary effort into a regulatory environment that's required of any owner of dams. So that includes the state, private owners, municipalities.
Just to follow up on the emergency command, so just having some conversations with some folks around the state who live in the shadow of a dam and are worried about the sufficiency of the what might be in those plans. Thinking about like, things like, the plan might say something like, should there be a breach, if you have a second floor, go to your second floor, what if you have no second floor? Or things like, if X, Y, Z happens, to take, someone needs to drive to the dam and do whatever, but considering that roads may be washed out, and so thinking about evacuation routes. And I will confess, like, I have not looked at these plans, so I don't know what they ask for. But just thinking about do you, in this process of taking ownership of the plan, which I think is great. Do you think that there is an opportunity? I'll just say, it seems like there might be an opportunity to look at what is in those plans and dig deeper somehow, but I'm saying this just as this is what I'm hearing from people, and I'm curious for your thoughts on any of it.
Yeah, so the anticipation is that through the rulemaking process is that the emergency action plans for any owner of a dam would be a mandatory, not a voluntary item. And so from my understanding from the dam safety program, what is within those emergency action plans is a regulated environment. So there's a very clear trajectory of what you need to do, who you need to contact, who are the emergency response. And again, the dam safety program's job is to evaluate and make sure our dams are safe, but if they are not emergency responders. And so it's connecting those two, it's connecting the people who know what the trajectory is of the dam and then with the emergency responders and making sure that that is an updated regular emergency action plan for each community.
So, and so sorry, how does that connection happen? Or is that a part of the emergency plan? Is that these connections need to be regularly made or something?
Yep.
Okay.
This is Hannah, and Hannah also works with our dam safety program, so feel free to chime in.
Sure.
Good record.
For the record, my name is Hannah Smith, and I'm an attorney with the Agency of Natural Resources. And the requirements for the emergency action plans, which includes the type of response chain that would be necessary to notify municipal, municipal leaders and leaders, if this goes up to sort of a regional planning commission level. That is going to be a requirement in those plans, and the phase 2 of the dam safety rules, which they're undergoing right now, will include all the requirements for these emergency action plans. So that is part of the rulemaking process, and it's based on a lot of what the Army Corps of Engineers requires now in terms of emergency action plans.
Okay.
So the details of those plans are gonna be part of this rule, that they're currently working.
So as a part of that process, what is in those plans may actually shift or.
It could be, yeah, there are going to be updates
Okay.
to a lot of the regulatory requirements that
Okay.
that will be included in the rules. To be clear too, and Ben would be the person to ask about this, but many dams already have emergency action.
Oh, yes,
Yes, it's just sort of an ongoing iteration of how do we make sure these plans are up to speed with the federal regs.
And
We can follow up though to tell you exactly what is an emergency action plans, because there is a protocol around what needs to be included in that, so we can make sure that you know what's in those.
I would love to see that.
Okay.
Thank you. That would be very interesting. And then, sorry, I have so many questions. Am I okay? Okay, one more, which is just, so who sets? It sounds like there's a set of things that have to be in those emergency action plans. Who sets what needs to be in there? So maybe it's this rulemaking process, or is there something federal that is sort of dictating that? And what is the likelihood that you all may go, the rulemaking process may go beyond what just the minimum is?
I don't have an answer to that right now. We're still sort of in the early phases of the rulemaking process. The program has been obviously, their capacity has been stretched by the floods over the last summer. So we can get back to you on that as well in terms of what the standards are for those plans and how they're being developed and yeah.
Thank you.
Candidates, thanks, a couple quick questions, so can we just get a copy of Wrightsville's? EAV, that possible? And on S218 staffing, so but Senator Westman, we have that bill that changes staffing. And I don't know if Commissioner, if you want to address that or Secretary Moore, but one thought is that we would just bring that provision into this bill. It's possible though that Senator Westman, as he sits on appropriations, kind of has a beeline to money and positions, so maybe it goes in the budget, but either with regardless of the path, just let us know if this agency supports the staffing provision for each week.
I have read it, but I'm gonna leave the answer to the secretary.
Yeah, I would need to look at it again just to make sure I'm clear on what it is, but we've been consistent in indicating and in fact moved into our base budget, the 2 limited service positions, because we know that is kind of the minimum staffing required for our dam safety program long term, is that 5-person team.
Right, and it goes a little further, so it adds 3, then there's a full-time administrative spot. Okay. Senator White and
Thank you, Chair Wright. What is the timeline for the rulemaking process? Like, when is it going into place?
It's slated for adoption July 1st, 2025.
Is there is likely going to be a flood again before then? What is the agency's thoughts on that situation? I guess I'm trying to put out there that I totally respect that you're in the process of doing something, but what I hear from constituents is we had a major flood, that even the time between when we got into session and are talking now, we had another flood event. And so time is of the essence and safety is of the essence. So I feel less compelled to wait for rulemaking, but when you say it's slated for January, you said 2025,
July 1st.
July 1st, 2025. That's what, a year, 6 months from now? We will likely have another flood in the meantime. Do you, and maybe our dates for introduction of these policies would be, so rulemaking happens, and then when is the likely rule requirement met? Like, if that's when it's done, that's when you finish the process. When is it likely, if you know, that then those will become, like, what would it be another year or?
No, the rule would go into effect on adoption.
Okay.
And the other thing that, to be clear on, is the dam safety rulemaking was adopted in 2 phases. So currently, the first phase is in effect. That outlines an inspection schedule that's mandatory for all dams in the state. It outlines certain elements of responsibility associated with dam ownership. Part 2 would be formal adoption of dam safety and design standards that could then be used in a more formal way when dams are inspected to provide dam owners with requirements for coming into compliance with those standards. So dams that all of the dams are currently regulated already. Dams that are, capable of impounding more than 500,000 cubic feet of water are being required to undergo a permitting process whenever a modification to that dam is proposed. Dams are being inspected on a regular schedule. Part 2 of the standard of the rules is just a formal adoption of the standards that we're applying when we do inspections currently.
I would also just add to that, I would argue that the portion of your bill around the dam safety program that is really sought after by our dam safety program would be the idea of a revolving loan fund.
Yeah.
Because part of the commissioner's testimony is that dams are not just owned by the state, the private owners, dam removal is the best option outside of dam removal. A lot of people don't have that option. And so it's repair, and our dam safety program, safety and public safety, is at the core of their mission. And so providing options for people who are private owners of dams to be able to have some kind of source of finance to be able to repair and keep safe those dams that they're not able to remove, I think that is a gap in the system that we have right now. And that was a component of your bill that they thought was really interesting.
Senator McDowell and Senator McCollum.
Rulemaking comes up in each of the issues that we've just had with wetlands preservation and dams. And people are making statements that, we do this, the rules are adopted. And I want to go back to Black Gum Swamp in Vernon, where the process was followed. It went through Elkhart, we got to the end of Elkhart and the Black Gum Swamp, which you can look up on Google. It's kind of interesting. It was designated, and the next day the administration withdrew. Torpedo ended rulemaking, and the Black Gum Swamp was left to where it used to be, and it currently is undesignated. And we're talking here today, the rule talks about its job in holding and retaining water and stopping flooding. And we're talking about some of the plans for the future, but in the past, we have not followed through on those, and we have allowed rulemaking to proceed, get to the very end, and at the last minute, have the rule withdrawn. So I would like, when the Black Gum Swamp gets addressed, I'll have more faith in what we're talking about doing. So,
If I can respond to that, first, I think it's important to note that the Black Gum Swamp remains a class 2 wetland and is extended the full protections of a class 2 wetland. The petition was withdrawn not because of any opposition within the administration, but because the town itself did not support the class 1 designation. And that's something that's allowed for in the way I believe our authorization was provided. So to suggest it has no protections is inaccurate, and to suggest this was made an action, a unilateral action of the administration is also inaccurate.
Mr. Chair, the swamp had gone through the process. It had been found to meet the criteria, and at the last minute after the rules had been gone through, it was withdrawn. Anecdotally, it was that one of the select board members on some of the land, I don't know if that's true or not, but someone in town pulled the plug on it. And it's not designated, and if we're gonna take flooding and wetlands seriously, these discussions have to lead to something that happens and doesn't get pulled at the last minute.
Thank you, Senator McCormick. Right. Anything else, Commissioner?
Not for me, Mr. Chair, but I think would be further educated and impressed by the service.
Senator Watson.
I do have one more dam related question, which I assume it should be more for you rather than the secretary, but
We'll see.
So in the section that is about the ownership of dams and the dam owner having strict liability for the safety of those dams. And but what I feel like I just want to clarify, what I feel like I'm hearing from you is that that particular part may be getting ahead of the rulemaking process, or no?
Yes. I can speak to that. This is Hannah Smith again. That section on liability is unrelated really to the rulemaking, which again adopts sort of substantive design standards. That question of liability is a legal issue. We haven't, in the state, we haven't adopted a strict liability standard or review for dam failures. It would be a standard that would be largely applied by courts or insurance adjusters in looking at failures. But it is separate and apart from the standards that we adopt.
And so you all are not necessarily opposed to that section?
I don't think.
Neutral.
Yeah, I don't think we have an opinion on it. We're a little confused by it. We don't fully understand the intent of it. We weren't involved in the drafting of that part of it, so we.
Oh, yeah.
Thank
you. All right, thank you.
I can, if it's acceptable to we go on into the secretary, I can ask Ben Green, but he had some opinions about that he shared with me, and they're completely gone out of my brain. I'm happy to have that conversation.
Thank you.
Right, well, easy come, easy go, it happens to all of us. So, it's a lot of information moving around. Senator McCallum.
My understanding is there are approximately 200 dams in the state that are privately owned, which support use to operate old mills, mill ponds. 20 years, give or take, Brookfield's dam collapsed and the water rushed out, and the water level dropped 6, 8, 10 feet or something like that. And the houses around the lake in Brookfield Village suddenly had mud flats between their homes and the water, which was unfortunate. And the dam was rebuilt because there's a floating bridge which crosses Brookfield, and the floating bridge was inoperable because it had fallen well below the previous water line. And the transportation fund paid to have the dam restored and the bridge brought back up and the road continued. That was fine for the town of Brookfield and for the tax base, the town of Brookfield, for the second homes and waterfront properties. but we have about 200 such dams in the state in places like Thetford, which is like fairly has been restored with a new dam, but that's what we're looking at, and we can talk about the rules and adopting the rules, but those dams are not gonna last forever unless there's a funding plan to replace them and perhaps use them as in water flow electric generation, which is a practical possible solution. But this is a big issue, and all dams fail and water runs downhill.
Mr. Chairman, you have a failed dam in your county as well, or your jurisdiction.
Which one are we talking?
The Boy Scout camp.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's failed. I think it requires us something like $500,000 investment to bring it up to specification.
You gotta supplement like off strength of the dam.
Yeah, well, and the good news I heard is that there may be buyers for that property and they're willing to take on the liability that goes with being in the loans. Your fingers crossed, It's a lot of money to raise and fund.
What if we did a revolving loan fund?
Well, so.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a picture to you, in terms of establishing revolving loan fund, as the agency given any thought to how we might capitalize it to begin with?
Yeah,
Could we receive capital funds? We seem to have many different ways that money comes to the state, so I don't know if there's a fund that's or a source that's particularly well suited to capitalizing this from the outset. And I think probably it will need steady capitalization because we have a long time until we start seeing any significant repayments. And even the repayments we're hoping for are very modest because we're trying to make it affordable, so the department have a proposal, thoughts on recommendations around funding revolving loan fund at a workable level for decades to come. That's a softball, but I mean, it's a genuine question, like it's gonna be a steady big lift. And you're in the water quality business, you might say, here's a particularly promising place to go, or we need to think about raising those funds anew.
I would say the latter. I don't want to get out in front of the governor's budget, but can say we don't have federal sources of funding that we're able to tap to create a revolving loan fund.
Once upon a time, we had a special switch and it was labeled Senator Leahy. We ended up with funding that helped for big projects.
Maybe we can have a Senator Welch switch.
I think his switch is smaller. Alright, great, thanks so much. Anything else you want to share with the committee before we hear from the secretary?
I do not. Thank you for your time and for listening. All great questions.
This is the.
I'm gonna correct the record. I appreciate entire. Wait, it is true.
Hey, Winter County,
The United States Senate is a seniority based system and
He doesn't chair for.
Senator Leahy was the most senior. Senator Welch is one of the most
Just refining your.
junior, adding some nuance.
Thank you for having me. For the record, I'm Julie Warren, the Secretary of Natural Resources. And sort of building off the excellent job Jason did recapping what you heard from our technical team last week. And the importance of the focus of this bill, ensuring no net loss of wetlands, protecting river corridors and floodplains, and dam upkeep or removal are all issues of truly critical importance to the agency. And as I hope you took from hearing from staff, areas of active focus and considerable work that's already ongoing. Before digging into the specifics of S213 though, I wanna be unequivocal in stating that the successful implementation of any version of this bill will require significant additional resources. And thought maybe just highlight a few of the initiatives that the agency is already engaged on. As a result of actions taken by the legislature over the past 5 years. We are leading on climate action, supporting the Climate Council and coordinating on behalf of state agencies. We are continuing the work needed to stand up an environmental justice unit. And fully integrate these important principles into our work. We're continuing to fulfill the implementation requirements of Act 64 of 2015 and Act 76 of 2019 around clean water and coordinating more than $50 million a year of investments. We're leading on PFAS monitoring and response efforts and fully expect EPA will change the federal drinking water standard at some point this year, which will require significant new action by this agency. We have initiated and are pursuing PCB testing at the more than 300 Vermont schools that were built prior to 1980. We've expanded Vermont's outdoor recreation offerings, including a $5 million a year BORAC grant program and welcoming more than 1 million visitors a year into our state parks. And we are managing one-time appropriations for things like brownfields remediation, state lands investments and fishing access areas and wildlife management areas, and a set of dam safety improvements on ANR-owned dams. And this is to say nothing of the literally hundreds of millions of dollars of investment opportunities that have been made possible by ARPA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And then on top of that, this summer, there were a series of catastrophic floods.
And so now you know why you're our favorite Asian.
Everyone's favorite.
Liz, given the, I don't know, the behavior of our society in the last century, we've placed so many things in jeopardy. Correct. It is requiring sort of an all hands on deck approach. So, I'm sympathetic and appreciative of the many things that you all do, and there's limits to how many things you can do. And always I say this, but I'm not on appropriation. So I can make the genuine offer that when we ask you to do something, we don't ever want you to just stretch.
Yeah.
But I can never guarantee that.
Correct, and you're stealing my thunder a little bit. But that's what I'm building to, which is, I'm unbelievably proud of the agency and how staff has frankly risen to meet the moments. And to serve Vermont and Vermonters, and I absolutely understand and share the sense of urgency that this committee is expressing in terms of the specific subject matter of this bill, as well as climate action writ large. But at this point, the agency's capacity to take on new things, large or small, is exhaustive. And make no mistake, what's envisioned in this bill is massive. In order to be successful, it must be appropriately resourced. And that resource includes both capacity to do the work, but also the time to do the work. There is no snap your fingers and have these changes occur overnight, as you alluded to, Senator Bray. This is a set of problems and challenges decades in the making, and it's not something we're going to be able to correct in a series of months.
Can I ask you a little something about that? So, sometimes I look at the bill and say, oh, it's a vision of what a program could look like. But I have not thought about it. It's really like, definitely not a snap the fingers kind of a thing. Is there a way, if it's an agreed upon vision, is there a way to structure a timeline that builds to it in a rational way that does support everyone along the line and helps maximize the chances of success?
I believe there is, and we'll suggest some first steps and what I see as sort of the most critical investments of time and resources that the bill proposes. If that, to the extent that that's helpful to the committee, and that we need to sort of, Maggie likes to say, ruthlessly prioritize.
Yes. I learned that from Judy.
Small world. So, and something we've talked about at various points over the years, and I'll put it back on the table again. I don't know if it's implementable, but we have talked along the line of ruthlessly prioritize. if we're saying river corridors, wetlands, dams is clearly a very high priority activity because of the pressure due to climate change. Are there other things that you're doing that we say, we would stop doing this and pick up this? And the legislature is not particularly good at withdrawing a request to do something. But honestly, I think it will be helpful on our side if we could start a dialogue that said, if we're gonna ruthlessly prioritize, then we should spend on the highest priorities. And there are things that are quote unquote nice to do, but maybe they're less important for us to do right now. And I know that staff is not entirely, people can't move from being a solid waste person to a dam person probably. But even so, I don't know if there's some flexibility there. We can free up obligations in order to take new things on.
I would argue that is how we've accomplished that book of work I read off to you. We added a set of limited service positions for the federal funding. Almost every other one of those initiatives has been accomplished with existing staff. Say the staff added for the climate office and the environmental justice unit, and so there is no. I think the things that we are doing now are responsive to either a state or federal mandate. By and large, there aren't a lot of voluntary activities, and in fact have scaled back some of our education and outreach efforts in order to ensure we have the capacity to meet the regulatory obligations. So as I say, the governor will unveil his budget next week, as I mentioned, and while you can be sure it contains important investments that will continue to improve Vermont's resilience in the face of the changing climate, it does not contemplate anything approaching what I believe the resources that would be required to implement 213 as drafted would be. And so I beg you that you not allow your thinking about the body of work that you task this agency with to become separated from the resources, both in time and capacity provided to do the work. There are no untapped reserves to draw on to support this sort of expansion, and appreciating the comments you made that the policy work is done here and the budget work is done there. I would encourage you to strongly consider, to the extent those resources don't arrive on the floor with the policy, that you can't allow the policy to move forward.
Well, speak frankly, I have regrets about EJ, the environmental justice bill left here with, I think, a $2.7 million allocation. I think it left town hall with like something like 0.7. And older and wiser, maybe. I would, one way to have responded would be to have modified through the budget itself, modified the obligations that bill entailed to scale them to the funds provided. I would think that would be sort of an honest way of doing things, but it happens so fast at the end usually that it's very hard to catch up. And I've never frankly thought about that before. Like if our colleagues don't move forward with money, then we should back a request off. Otherwise, what are we doing? Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I feel like we end up being stuck in that. These are all important things, and I don't want to diminish the importance of any of them. But I also need to be able to have a set of jobs and roles and responsibilities of the agency that people feel they can be successful with, because staff turnover only magnifies the challenges we're getting right now when people feel they have an impossible job. So we can turn now to some of the key areas of the bill, and we'll start with the wetlands restoration and mapping piece. As Jason noted, conservation is core to the mission of this agency. And I know that you did hear about both the permitting program in Jason's shop, as well as the restoration work in Fish and Wildlife. And I think there's broad agreement, you'll hear no arguments from the agency, that better mapping is crucial for wetlands management. But we really feel like that better mapping is underway, and on sort of a schedule at this point where it meets the need that had previously been unaddressed. Our maps were woefully out of date, and that is why those resources have been essential to completing this statewide update. That will be done in 2026. We do believe there are diminishing returns for a second update to that mapping within 5 years is envisioned by S213. And so our recommendation would be to instead have the agency monitor technology advancements and determine when the next basin-wide update is appropriate. And can have some sort of regular reporting requirement back to this committee of jurisdiction if that would be of interest. But I think tracking that over time is important. And then just to speak a little bit about the mitigation components of the rule, of the bill. Obviously, mitigation is required currently under the Vermont wetland rules. And it's only after avoidance and minimization has been maximized. And this is important because intact wetlands are better than newly restored wetlands. So while the goal of the bill of onsite compensation is good because it would restore wetlands locally, it's also pretty labor intensive to go about it, that approach. It requires a lot of hand-holding by agency staff. And it also can be difficult to find people to be the long-term stewards of those types of projects. And this is in no small part why we offer the in lieu fee program, which is the payment system where Ducks Unlimited, in the case of Vermont, is restoring wetlands for permit project impacts. It has the benefit of creating larger wetlands that may have more functions and values than smaller discrete wetlands. And certainly requires less hand holding because we're able to take advantage of the expertise of an organization like Ducks Unlimited in restoration activities. The bottom line is if the agency or if the committee wishes to pursue that more intensive approach to conservation and restoration work that's envisioned by the bill, that we would need additional resources as there are no reductions in our other responsibilities contemplated within S213.
Mr. Chairman, could you describe what that would look like? What additional resources you would need? Because I know you had a number staffing wise for the other stuff. I don't know if you contemplated a staffing number for this.
I don't believe the program has produced a staffing number for this, no. We could estimate that based on what's proposed there.
That would be very helpful, because that is an important piece.
Sure. Moving on, unless there are other questions, the flood hazard area and river corridor components of the bill.
On the wetlands, you were talking about no net loss, and the bill contemplates a net gain. Can you say something about, they're not equivalent, you know, it reminds me of the primary soil.
Yeah, and I think are you looking on a project by project, site by site basis, or are you looking statewide? And that's where the figures Jason presented are so important. That, you know, and we can provide it to the committee, the most recent report out of the wetlands program, they report to EPA every year on permitted losses. Less than 5 acres in calendar year 2022, which is the most recent year we have full data for. During that same year, Fish and Wildlife restored over 100 acres of wetlands. And so that's not on a site by site, parcel by parcel, project by project basis, but overall in Vermont, we are seeing a net gain of wetlands.
Yeah, so from your point of view as like a natural resource manager, what sort of granularity makes the most sense to you?
I think you're talking about in terms of site by site versus landscape level.
Yeah, I mean, I don't sort of know how fine that would sort of be. Might you go bigger than site by site, so like part of a watershed or a basin or a county or a.
I think you do want to work at the watershed or basin scale. I think it's one thing for me to be here in the A&R lane talking about wetlands. There's also other public interests that are located here, where there may be wetlands within a designated center or within a permitted industrial park. And do we want to hold these to the same standard, which has the effect of potentially pushing sprawl to other places? And so having a little bit broader view, not just of that individual project, but what is in the best interest of the watershed is really important. And finding that balance point. And I would argue, I think we are close to that balance point right now. And I think the fact that we're creating 20 times the amount of wetland that we're losing each year probably tips it in favor of sort of our current approach meeting the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Totally respect that response. However, it doesn't seem like it bore out on the reality of flooding. Like we didn't have the wetland space we needed to actually prevent some of the downtown disasters.
I would argue, I think while certainly wetlands would have helped.
Yeah.
I think even when Vermont was undeveloped, there would have been natural disasters and floods and.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not a presence absence piece, and as I say, I think there's a balance that has to be found. It's going to be an imperfect balance between homes and businesses and roads and schools and what people need to be able to live in Vermont. And protecting those essential natural resources to help mitigate floods. And I guess I wouldn't make it as black and white an issue as you're describing, where simply because there has been some amount of wetland loss, that is why we saw the flooding. I think given that precipitation, the flooding would have occurred regardless.
Okay, I guess my point's a little more nuanced than that, so let me, if it's all right, I just wanna re-clarify, which is. We need more wetlands than we have now, is what I heard from your staff. Not because we've always had flooding and flooding occurs naturally, but because of climate change, we're seeing an increased amount. So
Yes.
while even if we went back to where we were pre-colonization, which is what they described, we still would not have the amount of wetlands to absorb some of the implications of the growing natural disasters that climate change has created.
Correct.
So I guess then that feels like,
And what I'm saying is, that is from the perspective of my wetlands program, right? And their entire role and responsibility is to think about wetlands protection, right, and restoration. And what I'm saying is sometimes you have to look a little broader than that and think about watershed needs too. And it may be a modest impact to a wetland in a certain location is acceptable because it prevents a significant amount of sprawl in another location. That while it may not have impacted a wetland, it creates stormwater concerns, it creates results in forest fragmentation, it may have other environmental impacts that need to be weighed. And having a degree of flexibility within our wetlands regulations and a relatively modest degree of flexibility is important in being able to think not only about that specific resource protection, but the larger watershed concerns.
okay, that's very helpful. So it sounds like from your perspective, it's not. What I think I just heard was it's not a building versus wetlands, it's forest fragmentation or other, cause I think that's if I'm correct, it's more of an environmental than should we put a building, okay, thank you, that's really helpful.
You're welcome.
But your wetlands people are persuasive.
They are. I have advocates for every resource you could imagine within the agency, all of whom who think they're the resource they steward is absolutely the most important.
Clarify, what you're saying, if I understand you correctly. So you have a problem, you come up with a solution to the problem. The solution might then create other
Yeah.
problems in the same general, yeah. If I may offer a statesman-like analogy, Curly Howard trying to get rid of fly paper. Stuck to his hand, he steps on it, it's freezing his hand, but now it's stuck to his shoe.
Yes.
And the hand wetland people were very persuasive, that was red.
My version of that is Captain Manhattan comes back. It's the spot that just needs moved in.
Thank you, that was very productive.
Sure. So I'll go to flood hazard areas and river corridors. And so as you alluded to earlier, Senator White, the way the 213 is drafted, it would essentially flip the responsibility for regulation of land use in FEMA flood hazard areas from our 274 participating communities to the state. And currently those 274 communities regulate land uses in the FEMA mapped flood hazard areas as part of their obligations as participants in the National Flood Insurance Program. These obligations are not just around new development, but also modifications to existing buildings, including repairs to flood damaged buildings when that happens. And includes any human-made change, so improved or unimproved real estate. And so permitting is really required at all scales, and this is a place where towns are sort of set up to do that site level permitting, the state isn't. And so again, it's trying to figure out what that sweet spot is. According to Rob and Rebecca, they estimate there are currently about 12,400 structures statewide located in or immediately adjacent to MAP flood hazard area. And we absolutely appreciate what you were raising, that this is an enormous challenge for small towns to administer a complex permitting program. But at the same time, our ability to get into 12,000 structures is going to be challenged as well. And so hoping there's a way to discuss opportunities for A&R to more effectively support our towns with this obligation as opposed to having the state take it over from towns.
Can I ask a question about the take it over version of thing? I mean, from just a theoretical point of view, is it, I think of the waterways, water system, watersheds as an integrated single system, and so regulate the most effective way probably to regulate it is as a system. And towns aren't necessarily, they're regulating a piece of the system, so am I right in thinking that ultimately we want to bring like a systems level approach to the challenge?
Yes, actually, what we would offer as an alternative is work to establish a statewide floodplain standard. That any town participating in the NFIP would adopt. So right now, each town has their own regulations, and they've been evaluated by FEMA for compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program, but they are not consistent from town to town. This compromises our ability to do any real training and direct technical assistance, in that our first step in coming into any community is having to crack open their floodplain regulations and see what site specific language they've adopted. And so by putting in place statewide floodplain standards, it would allow the existing state resources and Rebecca's team to provide direct technical assistance to communities. It would allow us to develop guidance and supporting documents, educational materials, and provide outreach necessary to ensure consistent application of these statewide standards. And that's something that just doesn't happen right now. I'd also offer that there's a moment in time here that this is particularly timely, and that FEMA is making changes to the NFIP program. Towns are gonna have to get in there and update their floodplain regulations regardless of any action by the state in order to remain in the NFIP program. And so if we're able to do this work now, it means they can get in there and change their floodplain regulations once.
So we had some testimony that indicated that, you know, although there's an incentive for towns to be involved and there's training offered, et cetera, that a voluntary program wasn't really attracting enough.
Yeah.
It wasn't garnering enough of a response to be truly effective overall, you know.
Well, it's not a voluntary program. If they're participating in the NFIP, the
Yeah.
town is obligated to do this work. Whether or not they're doing it maybe could be the issue, but they have made commitments to FEMA that are a condition of community members being able to access flood insurance.
So
Yeah.
I'm not remembering the testimony accurately enough, so I'm saying voluntary. But the thrust of it was that local efforts were in the end largely inadequate. And
We believe that this would be a fairly significant step forward in improving the efficacy of local efforts. Because part of the challenge right now is we don't offer training or direct technical assistance because we are not five people in that shop are not experts in 274 towns. Theme and variations on floodplain regulations.
so if you were to, if we were to go this route, would you need more staff for all that outreach and technical assistance?
I would like to come back to you on that question. It in part depends on what are the elements of the minimum floodplain standards that we would push out to towns. And so I think there's a sort of maybe more dialogue needed in that space, but I'm trying to simply, I think, frame it in an approach. Maybe, recognizing the concern Senator McDonald raised, our preferred approach would be to have a directive come from the legislature to undertake the establishment of statewide standards through rulemaking so that they can be adopted, they can be updated periodically as needed, and feel that this is very important. As FEMA's continues to evolve in this space, it would allow us to be more agile.
Sure, and if we were going the rulemaking route, that means we won't probably see a rule for 18 months, something like that.
We can come back to you with what the schedule would be. Our team is very cognizant of the fact that FEMA is at work right now on their changes to the NFIP, federal NFIP regulations, and really feel strongly that we would wanna work in conjunction with that and not try to ask communities to do that work twice.
You use the word minimum standards, do you have, so I get it, people need to qualify in order to be in. Does that set the bar lower than we might want to set the bar, like that we're only getting compliance, but there would be stronger, more robust programs that would be above and beyond standard.
I don't think the intention would be to preclude people from going above and beyond. And in particular, we know that okay, an example would be certain communities along Lake Champlain. Generally, we require 2 feet above base flood elevation in terms of flood proofing. Following the high lake levels in 2011, a number of lakeshore communities set that at 3 or 4 feet. We don't want to be the ones telling, oh no, you can only have 2 feet, right? So there are places where communities may wish to go above and beyond. There is a lot more variation than just that difference in base flood elevation. And so trying to have a consistent set of standards across the board, and then but with flexibility for communities to be able to do more.
So, Program Center Watson, if you could come back to the committee with sort of an outline of this strategy and time for implementation and budgetary consequences, that will be helpful.
Yeah.
Senator Watson.
Thank you. One of the appeals of having the state do the permitting, in my mind anyway, was that there would be coordination across the watersheds, right? And that municipalities, they're responsible for their little piece, but how they're affected upstream and downstream is sort of out of their control. And so it's nice to have that sort of larger entity thinking about that. And so could you like just respond to that? I think I have other questions, but maybe I'll just stop.
Sure, I mean, I think the evaluation that's done relative to flood hazard areas isn't limited to the municipal boundaries. So if a project was contemplated in an area of one community where essentially the runoff and the impact would be felt downstream, the calculations would reflect that. And if it's not base flood elevation at only a point in time in that community, it is a broader evaluation that's contemplated under the National Flood Insurance Program. And so I don't think that the flood hazard regulations is actually the place you get to that type of watershed thinking. I think that's really focused on impacts, and maybe when we talk a little bit about river corridors, that gets to that piece more. But that's different than the flood hazard area.
Okay, well, and that was gonna be my next question, is how are you thinking about the river corridor protections? Because and so I'll just hold off if that's.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. So then the other piece, just before we move out of the flood hazard areas, would be the other thing the committee may wish to consider is to extend what we call the FARC rule jurisdiction to development under Act 250. Knowing there may be an Act 250 bill headed your way, and this would essentially clean up the process Because right now we make recommendations to district commissions as opposed to issuing permits, and that may be a modest change that also sort of supports this statewide consistency.
I apologize, I didn't really understand that. I apologize.
No, so right now, our park rule extends jurisdiction under Act 250 to municipalities without existing flood hazard bylaws only. Otherwise, we just make recommendations to the district commission, which they may or may not take. If we effectively have the same requirement regardless of municipal bylaws, and this is maybe a stopgap or a temporary step if we're moving to statewide standards. But right now, we're in the position of district commissions have the ability to take or leave what would be a requirement in a municipality where bylaws don't exist.
That's the point.
Isn't an A&R permit, doesn't that create a rebuttable presumption?
It does, but it's not required for municipalities where bylaws exist, and so district commissions end up with a discretion in those spaces.
Just, thank you, Mr. Chair, but just to clarify, only what we heard 10% of towns actually have the bylaws. I believe that's where maybe some of the confusion between what does FEMA require versus what the municipalities are expected to do, but have not necessarily done. I think that's 10%, I think was the amount we got for who had adopted bylaws. And we saw a great map that showed the towns.
Yes. I will have to get back to you on that. I'm sorry, thought it was in the more detail.
Hey, we're learning on the fly, so. Me too.
So then maybe just to touch briefly on map river corridors, and I just think it's again important to have a sense of the universe of what we're talking about here. We have about 5,600 miles of mapped river corridors around larger rivers and streams statewide. This represents about 209,000 acres of land. For perspective, this is 5 times the land area that was regulated by the Lake Shoreland Encroachment Program, which is 42,000 acres. That program is currently staffed by a team of 4. And would just reflect that given the scale of the sort of the regulated area that is contemplated by river corridor regulation in S213, we really feel like public outreach and engagement is essential before jurisdiction is expanded. Some of the most difficult and complicated enforcement cases my agency engages on are people who build things without knowing about the regulation. And then asking them or directing them to remove something that represents significant investment from a poorly conceived location. Absent doing significant public outreach and engagement before proceeding with river corridor regulation, we're setting ourselves up for just an absolute disaster, in my opinion. And so would encourage you to contemplate, this is one maybe I think to your point, Senator, right, the goal is the right goal. I think we've got some real work to do before we're ready for it.
The shoreline bill was not an easy process.
No, and I think it predates my time in this seat, but I think it was a 18-month or 2-year kind of outreach and engagement effort by both agency staff as well as key legislators that did listening sessions, developed some draft materials, and then went back to folks with those proposals.
It's difficult it went from rulemaking back and then became statutory implementation. And unfortunately, one of the consequences this is unavoidable. While it was under discussion, a lot of work that might be called regrettable was done because people saw regulation coming. There was a rush to develop before the regulation.
Yeah, and it may be sort of thinking through ways to handle that transition time would also be an important component, because I agree, there are at least several significant projects that come immediately to mind that are exactly as you described.
Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, and just in closing, that can't emphasize enough that I think there would be truly significant new staff capacity needed at the agency to implement these provisions. S 213 is implemented. And absent those resources, it could have the unintended but adverse consequence of affecting the ability of Vermont communities to continue to participate in the NFIP if we end up out of compliance with those FEMA requirements. We'll touch quickly on dam safety, but recognize we spent a lot of time there, and frankly, most of the points I wanted to make have already been discussed, and so maybe just would reiterate the important component to my mind of the legislation in front of you is consideration of this revolving loan fund to support dam owners with necessary repairs or removal. We actually have resources within our clean water budget at times, as well as the Lake Champlain Basin program that support removal. But there are no great options for us to help private dam owners with necessary repairs. And there are any number of dams out there. Senator McDonald, you provided a couple of examples of structures that serve important recreational functions, but also some flood control functions and may have hydroelectric generation associated with them. And really feel the absence of having resources available to support landowners. We're gonna have a regulatory set of tools to require folks to do those inspections and make improvements, but there's a blood from a stone analogy here, and absent resources to support some of the improvements that are needed, I'm not sure we're gonna find the kind of success I think we all would like to see.
Yeah.
What do we do? Business as usual.
In terms of,
We got 200 dams. And
more than
if and when they fail, we've got minor or catastrophic flooding. And there's no resources to deal with what we know is out there. What do we do?
what I'm saying is the revolving loan fund component of S 213 is important for exactly that reason. That there is need for resources to help with.
The revolving loan fund that we be paid for by Bucks Unlimited or what?
We'll need to work together to find a source to capitalize.
We work all the time together to find sources, we find sources and they get vetoed, and then we play the override the veto game.
I'm not aware that there's been a proposal to capitalize a revolving loan fund for dams previously. And currently we are working on a shared priority of the administration and the legislature to make needed improvements to the 80 ANR owned dams. There was a commitment of one-time general fund 2 years ago now. And we are continuing to use those resources to do exactly the sort of work we're envisioning is needed on a larger scale of private dam owned, privately owned.
Mr. Green had some great data for us. Can you help us understand the need, thinking about the Venn diagram, it's like dams that were of significant hazard and then dams that were in not good shape. It's like, if I were to
Yes.
think the piece that we would go at first, it would be where they overlap.
Yeah, and I'd
I
have to
don't
get
know
back
how
to you
many
with that.
dams that is and how much money that is, but if we were to
So I think that
build
work
the
is
budget, I'd start there, right?
well, there's two pieces to it, right? I think that work is in process for non-ANR owned dams, that our efforts today have really been focused on keep getting our own house in order, so to speak. And we have that information for our dams. I think the other piece is, there's a little bit of proof in the pudding here to see if people will actually take us up on these loans and how that, like, how much demand there is absent pretty heavy stick to force people's interest.
Well, the liability stick will
Yeah,
enliven. But and just even regardless of where we land on liability and all the rest. I just don't have a very clear sense of the need. And if you could help us
We
develop a list, then we could start to look at money near term and long term.
we can put that together. I mean, that is one of the sort of pieces we're building is we won't have full information on all the privately owned dams because we're doing a less thorough inspection than we're doing of our own, or engineering evaluation, I guess I should say, than we're doing of our own facilities. But we can bring you back additional information.
Great, Senator Watson?
Thank you. I'm just thinking about where to find funds to capitalize something like this. I mean, do dam owners currently pay anything into a state coffer? They set permits or something.
There's a registration fee.
They pay an annual registration fee.
Okay.
But it is modest.
Yes.
Compared to the capital needs of these dams.
Okay. Just thinking about like, is that an opportunity? Could we? How would we go about finding, if say we were going to increase that fee, to see how much could be generated reasonably, or is that not a place to look? What do you think?
My gut would be, do you know what the fee is currently? I feel like it's a few $100s.
Yeah, it is, and it depends too on the size of the dam, I can check.
Okay.
So it's relatively modest, so even doubling it would only generate maybe tens of thousands of dollars and feel like the need is more like millions.
Yeah, right, okay. Okay, well, thanks.
Yep.
Park fees
Spending
are,
the money.
park fees are go way.
Yeah.
So, next one here.
We did that through rule, it was an interesting twist, another whole conversation, Senator McCollum.
Hey, we took testimony last week, we were talking about river corridors, all else being equal, the first place you look is to simply let a river do what it wants to do. Water wins,
Yeah.
just let nature take its course. A dam, by definition, contradicts that.
Yeah.
We are in the business, in some cases, of removing dams,
Correct.
restore the stream, enhance it as efficient and so on.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are dams that are deteriorating that we want to repair.
Correct.
Because we like the impoundment of stream.
Correct.
Is it impoundment or impoundment? Because
I
it
say
creates
impoundment.
pond.
I say impoundment.
Impoundment, that's right. In any case, are we clear enough? Is the language of the law clear enough? About how you know which is which?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've sort of been working it from the ends, right?
Yeah.
Where there are things that, dams that are clearly, the best solution is to remove them. And from the other end, where dams where there's clearly a significant either flood control or recreational resource where they need to be maintained.
Yeah.
And the question you're asking, to my mind, is going to get called as we get closer to the middle. And I think there's a lot of, it depends there, depends on the interests of the dam owner in particular. And whether they continue to want to make the necessary investments in those dams. The ones that have been slated for removal or removed to date. Generally have been ones where the owner was, not just okay with, but actually actively, yes, engaged in the removal, and there's hundreds of them statewide, so we have no shortage yet.
Can I chime in on the answer to that question as well? It's not an answer, it's more of a perspective, is that channeling our dam safety program, safety is the key here. And so for them, it's a public safety question versus should the dam be there or not for whatever purpose it's there for. It's really, what is this, the community safety mechanism there? And then the other perspective of that too is I don't think you should legislate on it only because the engineering that goes into determining the hazard or the safety and just all of the mathematics that go into that as well and the science that goes into that. I think your choice is between is it a public, is it there, what is the public safety component of it versus is it there for recreation or hydro or other purposes? I think the perspective should be from our dam safety program is the community.
Correct, and we have partners that are pursuing dam removals for other reasons besides dam safety. In particular, habitat concern and how many miles of river can be opened up to aquatic biota by a particular dam removal. And that's US Fish and Wildlife Service, our own Fish and Wildlife Department. BNRC has done work that's related to habitat restoration, so, but you're right, our dam safety program really comes at it with the safety first view, and then other partners are bringing other considerations into those conversations.
Just, it seems, if you're saying that we're at the extremes at this point, that maybe we don't have to do this now, that this bill strikes me as a good place. If we want to clarify and harden the language, this would be one more, but getting back to the wetlands. We have constituents who don't believe there's such a thing. They're swamps,
Yes,
and you drain the swamp.
yes.
Is our existing language clear enough about the value of wetlands? You spoke articulately about it.
Yeah.
We agree.
Yeah,
Is the law clear enough when, in particular, if we're gonna be, you having towns do some of the regulation?
yeah, I mean, I think the challenge of wetlands is that they have different sets of functions and values, and there's some that everyone would look at, whether they call it a swamp or a wetland, and agree that this is an important natural area to be protected, and then there are others that don't have that same look and feel, particularly if people have been mowing them as part of their yard. Where it may be a more challenging conversation. We also know that wetlands can be a little bit ephemeral and that they move over time depending on what's happening uphill and downhill of a particular piece of property. But I think that was a very long way of getting back to, I think the improved mapping is really one of the most critical tools that will help in these conversations. Right now, we don't provide what I would argue is great notice to people that there may be a wetland resource on their property. And so it comes as a surprise oftentimes, versus I think having better maps will help Vermonters anticipate there may be a wetland resource on their property, and just that kind of state of mind is really important to the success of our work.
You know that I support your work. And if we have differences, it's that I wish we were maybe a little more attentive. But I've got constituents that think you people have lost your minds.
Yeah, I think I probably hear from some. So, yeah, to me, the mapping is the first step in helping improve that relationship, because right now we get a lot of, how could I have known? And the answer is, well, you would have had to hire a consultant, which is not the way we wanna approach things. Better, more robust maps is going to, I hope, really help improve those conversations and raising awareness for landowners, for municipal officials, where these resources exist.
Making maps cost money, you know, we get a private make maps.
There was, the governor proposed in FY '23, and you all supported $250,000 one-time appropriation, as well as, I believe, $100,000 increase to DEC's base budget to both sort of move us forward in the mapping, which is the work that Laura spoke to and Jason referenced, and then allow us to have a maintenance of effort in perpetuity.
As we identify wetlands that are on people's property, can you remind the committee and your council with you, like how does it play out legally in terms of someone might not surprisingly feel like it's a sort of taking to start to regulate something in a more stringent way because of its natural resource function?
Correct.
So you must have to address this, like people don't you end up sort of getting accused of a taking by virtue of regulating, and then what's the legal foundation to understand it? Like it's the law allows you to do it, but I'm not remembering exactly why that from missing.
I would prefer to Hannah if she knows the answer.
So generally, the way that the regulatory program in Vermont is set up, it does allow you to do the work. It requires that you minimize your impact on the resource to the extent practicable while you're still achieving the project purpose. So if there's we haven't run into a challenge that has raised a complete taking of someone's property, because generally we are authorizing work to move forward when there is no alternative location and no further way to minimize the impact of the resource. So the one exception are the class 1 wetlands, and again, there is no taking because those are very clearly, those go through a rulemaking process where the legislature reviews and approves the designation of those areas as class 1, and even in those instances, there are certain exemptions to the wetland rules where activities can take place when they're necessary for emergency operations or water intakes. So we haven't, our regulatory program does not impose a burden on landowners that typically eliminates any useful use of their property.
Like Gum Swamp,
Yes.
what happened there?
As the secretary referenced, the support, local support was withdrawn and the agency moved forward with changes to the rules, which included designation of other class 1 wetlands in that area.
So the system we have,
It's still on the list of class 1 wetlands to be designated. We just have to go through another rulemaking.
water flows over lists of things. I'm sorry.
I agree with you.
And we have these great plans. We either don't fund them, we don't enforce them. We go, oh, well, we'll worry about that later. And
Well, the wonderful thing about wetland classification is that class 1 wetlands don't usually cost us any money. So we can go ahead and designate them all over the place as we get petitions.
except when we don't,
Sometimes when local support's withdrawn, it's really difficult to move forward with
the
redesignation.
chair was asking me about, how do we do this? I mean, I was drafted once. And I had a choice of going to jail or going into the draft. But when it comes to these life-threatening things, we have a different way of dealing with it, which is we're gonna depend on Bucks Unlimited.
Well, we don't typically assign criminal penalties.
Then we're gonna have floods. And then we're gonna play this game where this is the way we'll deal with flooding. But we're not gonna pay for it. Or if we do pay for it, it's
So, Madam Secretary, in the case of, what's the role of local support for redesignating class 2 to class 1, like? How does it?
We see it
How
as
does it,
essential.
okay, and what is the implications of being reclassified, and what are those?
Correct. It is a wider buffer that's required around the class 1 wetland, and then there's a much higher test. In terms of the conditional use that Hannah spoke to, and that it has to be a public good. So an example of where we had a very detailed conversation about this, but actually, and then moved forward with the class 1 designation was up at Sandbar. There are class 1 wetlands, that is also where the drinking water intake for Brotherton or Champlain Water District.
Yeah.
So one of those very large drinking water intakes is within the boundaries of what is now a class 1 wetland. And so we worked with the affected municipalities to make clear that if they need to maintain their drinking water intake, that will be an allowed use as opposed to something precluded by that class 1 designation.
Right,
I just, can I make a couple points in closing, recognizing we're running over time? One is just to say, the issue around takings, Senator Bray is an important one, and I suspect something we will hear, loud choruses of voices over, around the river corridors, and yet, to me, is another reason to sort of go slow, a little slower to go fast in doing that public outreach and engagement before we dive into rules directly. I just wanna close also by saying how much I appreciate the intent of S 213. The importance of what wetlands, river corridors, floodplains and dam safety. Are all really essential as we work to respond to the impacts of a changing climate. And am committed to working with this committee to make the bill manageable. But again, can't stress enough that it has to be staffed and we have to have a timeline and stepwise approach that allows us to be true partners in this work. So look forward to continuing to engage with you on this.
Great, so, right, I know everyone's busy, but if you can start to outline in whatever form what that looks like, whether it's drafting language or just sort of an outline of a program, and then if we can start looking at the dam budgets, you know, I mean,
I know.
dam budgets. That will be helpful too, so we can start thinking about the money piece. I think it is our hope to have this bill like out, you know, if something is guessing, like 3 weeks. You know, maybe it could be a little faster than that. So thank you very much. We will.